This is part 2 of the databases and T-SQL course. In this video, we'll be covering module number 3, in which we're going to explore different data types and see how a basic database is basically created using what's called DDL, or data definition language. From this video, we learn about the different data types that are commonly used in databases. So essentially, the most common ones are int and tiny int, with int being short for integer. And really, there are other data types available, of course. And really, the usage of any particular data type is contingent on primarily the degree of numerical precision required in meaning how many, for example, digits are going to be stored in one particular data type, how many decimals would need to be stored. And then secondly, the actual use case of the data, how it's going to be used and possibly transformed in the database, essentially. So the other types of data include ones that are based on Unicode, and really a lot of data types are very similar to each other, but they really vary by the byte size. So another factor in consideration for selecting which data type to use in a database is how much how much how many bytes or how much memory each data type will store. So some other types of data include money, float, which is kind of similar to integer, but it's more approximate in nature by its precision. Date time, which is used to store, as the name would suggest, date and time values. Um, char, varchar, and a lot of these data types are similar to a name or identical in name to data types used in programming languages, such as Python or JavaScript. And some data types even have internal calculation functions, meaning you can actually combine, for example, with datetime offset, you can have the SQL program compare the difference between two dates to provide a, a time duration between those two dates. So not only is data obviously stored in a database, but like I had said, it can also be manipulated or also converted. So an example of that is how you can take one data type, such as cast, which is a money-based data type. And how do you know if it's money-based? Is because it has the dollar currency symbol inside of the parentheses. And if you use this as varchar, it'll function. It'll basically convert the dollar sign, the dollar data type to a varchar data type. So it's worth noting that you obviously can't convert every kind of data type to any kind of data type to any other kind of data type. There are limits and restrictions, of course. For example, they give how numerical based ones cannot be converted to image based data types, which is pretty much intuitive. So we'll be moving forward to discussing database objects now. In the first 8 minutes of the video, some different terms are discussed, essentially. The first of which are views. So basically, in the SQL Server program, they have what are called views, and it's essentially a virtual table that contains stored query objects, essentially. But the actual objects within the table are to be accessed in the underlying actual table, basically. So these are examples of views that are called system views that contain said query objects. The next term that's discussed is what's called a stored procedure. Essentially, a stored procedure is a data retrieval methodology in which specific parameters can be run repeatedly to search for and retrieve certain kinds of data. And they're written as what are called statements in a compiler, essentially. So this is an example of a stored procedure that can be used. And it can be run as many times as needed to retrieve data, essentially, from a table. So the syntax is kind of similar to that of other programming languages in that you have if and else being used in the procedure. And essentially, like I just said, the same parameters can be run to return or retrieve different values in the table. To counter stored procedures, you have what are called user-defined functions, which actually don't involve any parameters whatsoever. So zero. They can involve zero, but they could also have more than zero. So that's one characteristic that differs from user-defined functions as compared to the stored procedures. They can have as little as zero parameters in their functions. And there are three main types of user-defined functions, mainly the scalar, the table valued, and the system. So these are just different, essentially these are just stored procedures, and user-defined functions act as two different methodologies for data retrieval within databases. That's why that's why they were created, essentially. Okay. One other point that's covered are the naming of actual objects in the SQL Server program. And there are two main ones. There's Pascal case and camel case. And just like in programming languages, either naming convention can be used. It really just depends on what the user prefers, essentially, when naming objects. So either can be used, just like in many other programming languages for the naming of database objects. In the next part of this video, we're actually going to perform a database demo on Microsoft Server Management Studio. So in the program, we're first going to have to connect the server log to our server authentication here. So after connecting, we're actually in our table view here. We can see all of the available databases and database objects. And these folders are collapsible or expandable. To create a database, it's as simple as selecting the databases and right-clicking to New Database. We're going to name our database object and call it My Demo DB for database. And all we have to do, we don't really have to change any of these parameters. You can just click OK. And there it appears as the My Demo DB object under databases. So I just demonstrated how to create a database object using the GUI or graphical user interface here on the table view. There's actually a second way of performing the same task of creating the database using essentially a script file in a query or .SQL format. So in the tutorial, there was an example given here to actually create the database using the script file. So we can actually demonstrate that right now. So what we'll be doing is we'll be going back to Server Management Studio, and then we'll actually just be clicking on this new query button right here. And then from there, we'll be able to write the script to create a database. And then after writing the script, we'll execute that script to check if it works, right? So we'll create database here. And we'll be calling this database sales. We'll give the name of it. And then the actual file name. So this will be a sales.mdf file for the actual file name. And then the next line is for the size of the file. Maximum will be 50. File growth parameter will be 5. So we'll end that create function, and then we're also going to specify the creation of a log file for database object. So this will be called sales log under sales underscore log. And instead of this being .mdf file, this will be .ldf. Next line is very similar, except that we'll just have the size of this log file start at 5 megabytes. Maximum would be 25. And then file growth would be 5. Be using sales and then go. So we're going to execute that. So what we're going to do here to, we're actually going to modify the script. We're going to pull a script from Stack Overflow as provided here and see if that will get us the table to be created. So the name here will be sales. Sale. So actually we're going to create this in a separate query file. Just go to sales. So this script works. So we're going to go ahead with this script for the purposes of this video tutorial. And I think the main reason for the script not being able to run for the creation of this table is if it doesn't have that if not statement. So that's the workaround for that. So as you can see here, it says commands completed successfully. So it was able to create successfully the sales table using an alternate script. Next, we're going to actually see our created sales database in our Object Explorer, Object View, by right-clicking with and selecting Refresh. And on our databases, there is the sales database right below my demo DB. Hence, we know it was created successfully. In the next part of this video, we're actually going to create a table using this script, basically. So we'll just do it right below our script file. We're going to create a new table called products. So DBO is database object. That would be the syntax for that. And then products one. And then here we specify some variables here: integer, varchar, money, and product description, including, so each of these, the product ID, product name, unit price, and product description would be essentially elements of the table. And then these items in blue would be known as the variables associated with the elements. The variables are, you can also call them data classes as well. So we're going to do that. So the product ID will be a null value, essentially. Product name. Unit price would be a money data class. Product description. Just save it. I'm going to now execute. No right column. No. Or we could put this in. Let's get this. So if it says that there's already an object named sales table, if we only want to run one portion of the query, we would just highlight the selected script and then press execute. But there already was, as was shown before, it was already created successfully. So we know by just simply refreshing and under database sales object tables, we can see, you can see DBO products one right here and DBO sales table. So both of these tables were successfully created according to our object explorer. So that's again how we always know when something was created successfully on T-SQL and Server Management Studio. Something else we can do to check if our script was run successfully according to what we specified is going further into the DBO.products1 table. We can actually click on this expander, and then under columns, we can actually see that in fact, just as we had specified here, the 4 columns were in fact created for the table DBO.products1. Next, we can actually specify the modification of a database name changing of the name essentially of the database. So we'll just simply use the alter database statement. So we can insert it here. Alter database change, or they're not change, but alter. So originally it was called sales. And then the name. I'm going to change that to sales forecast. And then we're going to highlight this, only this portion of the script file. And then we're going to press it. And then we're going to, as we can see in here, the database name sales forecast has been set. So what we're going to anticipate in our object viewer is when we right click and hit refresh, it'll change it to sales forecast. Do that again. There it is, sales forecast, just as we had specified in these statements. The tutorial concludes with the option of being able to essentially delete a database object, and that is honestly most easily accomplished by just simply right-clicking and then pressing delete in the GUI, and then you would just check off this close existing connections checkbox, such that you don't receive the error that the existing database is already in use. So it would prevent the deletion of it. But when you check this off, it doesn't, because you would close an existing connection. So that's how the tutorial concludes. And moving on to DDL statements. DDL statements. So in this final video of the module, synopsis is given as to how we basically created different database objects in Server Management Studio. So essentially we use the create, alter, and drop functions for our databases basically. And there was one more feature that was highlighted in the video. Essentially, you can take your existing database that was already created, and you can actually, on your object viewer, you can go to you can right click and go to script database as drop and create to a new query editor window. It's actually going to take all of the information behind the database and generate this script file with many different function availabilities. As you can see, there's alters, one of them, altering to change and modify the database. So luckily, these functions don't need to be memorized, and this script file can be used regeneratively for many different databases, essentially. So that pretty much concludes the module number 3 in creating databases and database objects. So in this tutorials, in this module, synopsis is given regarding some of the terms that were used: database objects, tables, views, stored procedures, the different cases that are allowable for the writing of the scripts, and of course the DDL or data definition language functions.